Good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to our roundtable, Walking Together, Strengthening Indigenous Newcomer Allyship. I'm Metin Gan, the RE Project Coordinator, and I will be your host for today's event. I am also pleased to have my colleagues Mahta and Tarana here, supporting me in facilitating this roundtable. Thank you for being here, Mahta and Tarana. Now let's take a look at what's on our agenda today. Next slide. As always, we will begin with the land acknowledgement. After listing some housekeeping details, I will talk a little bit about the RE project so you have a better understanding of our mission and goals. Then we will have a short survey to see who is joining us today. Following that, we will hear from our panelists. Then you will have a chance to ask your questions or share your ideas on the subject. There's a lot to cover, so let's get started with our land acknowledgement. Although today's event is conducted virtually, I would like to begin by acknowledging the land on which we stand. Today, I acknowledge that I am on the traditional territory of the Wet'nut, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations. Takaronto, known today as Toronto, has become a home to many Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. It is crucial to express our solidarity with Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, who continue to experience colonial violence, including intersectional, gender-based violence against the Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people. Apart from our Indigenous participants and panelists, we are all newcomers to this land. Whether your ancestors came here centuries ago from Europe or were forcibly brought from Africa, whether we arrived recently seeking a better life or as refugees fleeing conflict, we are all newcomers compared to the Indigenous peoples who have been stewards of this land for millennia. Therefore, our actions should go beyond the mere reading of land acknowledgement statements at the beginning of our events. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves and our clients about the pre- and post-colonial history of this land. The knowledge we gain through education should translate into action, demonstrating solidarity with Indigenous peoples at both individual and organizational levels. Today's roundtable focuses on the roles and responsibilities of parties involved in the settlement of privately sponsored refugees in this regard. As we discuss how we can strengthen Indigenous newcomer allyship throughout this knowledge exchange event, we hope to take a step forward in contributing to reconciliation and decolonization in the settlement sector. Next slide. A quick note for those who have just joined, this meeting is being recorded. During the Q&A session, if you prefer not to have your question recorded, you have got two options. You can type your question in the chat and we will read it for you, or you can ask us to temporarily pause the recording and we will resume after your question. If you wish to speak, please be mindful of ASL interpretation. Speak slowly to assist our ASL interpreters. And remember, we have plenty of time for questions. Let's make it easier for our ASL interpreters to do their job. On another note, while we would love to see your faces, especially during the Q&A session, we kindly ask everyone to keep their microphones muted during the presentation. This helps us maintaining a smooth experience for everyone and avoids potential background noise disruptions. Next slide. At OCASI, whether in virtual spaces or otherwise, we firmly oppose all forms of racism, sexism, or xenophobia. Our aim is to establish a welcoming and respectful environment for learning and dialogue. We encourage everyone to engage in a manner that is respectful and considerate of the views and experiences being shared. Now, let's shift our focus to the wheel of power and privilege displayed here. Please take a moment to reflect on it. This wheel illustrates various factors that can impact our lives, such as our background, wealth, or education. It is crucial to acknowledge that these factors often intersect, creating layers of experience that can influence individuals in complex ways. In discussions like this, individuals who perceive they have less power may hesitate to speak up. We are dedicated to challenging this by fostering an environment where all voices are heard and valued equally. If you do not feel comfortable asking your questions in English, my colleague Mahta speaks French and Persian, and I speak Kurdish and Turkish. We do not want language to prevent you from participating, so feel free to ask your questions in the language you are most comfortable with. Next. Many of you might already be familiar with the ARI project. However, for those who are new to our events, let me give you a brief overview of what we have been working on. The ARI project began in 2018 in partnership with Refugee 613, with a clear focus on improving collaboration between settlement professionals and refugee sponsors to ensure that privately sponsored refugees receive the best possible support. During its first phase, ARI conducted comprehensive research and identified specific challenges in the sector. To address these challenges, ARI developed a two-dimensional strategy: intentional connection and knowledge exchange events. In 2021, ARI entered its second phase, which we refer to as ARI 2.0, and this phase is funded by IRCC until 2025, April 2025. Next. In this phase of the project, we continue to implement intentional connection and knowledge exchange practices. Through knowledge exchange events, we conduct roundtables and webinars to bring together settlement and sponsor communities to share info and build understanding. And through Ambassador Agency Initiative, we aim to support South-Po partnership to implement elements of ARI promising practices and continue to learn and share tools in order to increase the service received by privately sponsored refugees. Next. I won't go into details of the ARI project today since we have limited time for such a broad subject. However, you can find a link to ARI's webpage in the chat. My colleague Mahta will drop it in a second. Please take a moment to visit the page for more information about ARI. Especially, there is a resources page. You can access to our needs assessment, recording of previous knowledge exchange events, and more. I would like to briefly mention that we are currently accepting applications for the Ambassador Agency Initiative until June 21st, 2024. You will find promotional materials in the chat box, including the application form and the participation guide. Please take a moment to review them and don't hesitate to reach out to me if you have any questions about it. My email address will also be in the chat box, and as well as you will find it on the promotional material. Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to invite you to participate in a brief survey. You will find the survey link in the chat. I have emailed it to you yesterday. If you already completed it, that's awesome, thank you. But if you're not, just to let you know, this is a 2-minute survey to help us to get to know those attending. Your answers are anonymous, and you can skip any questions that you do not wish to answer. Your input will help us to improve future webinars. Once you have completed the survey, I will introduce our speakers and leave the floor to them. Let me see if the link is in the chat box. Yes. When you complete the survey, please give me thumbs up so I will know people are able to see it. Thank you, Luso. Oh, my colleague is just warning me. Deadline for ambassador agency, I think I said June 1st. It's not June 1st, it's June 21st. Okay, please mute yourself if you're not speaking.
I will take it from you tomorrow. Okay. Keep it in your purse. Okay.
Sorry, somebody's mic is on. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's continue. Next slide. So why are we here today? What are we going to talk about? Before I explore today's topic, it's essential to recognize that June is National Indigenous History Month in Canada. This month provides an opportunity to honor the rich history, heritage, resilience, and the diversity of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We encourage all participants to take the time to deepen their understanding of the enduring impact of colonialism on Indigenous peoples in Canada and worldwide. So the idea of having this knowledge exchange event came about last November when I attended the Canadian Council for Refugees fall consultation in Calgary. There was a workshop about the Third Safe Country Agreement. One of the panelists was from the Blackfeet Nation, and the other was an Indigenous person, a lawyer from what's today called Colombia, who is currently seeking refuge in Canada. So these two individuals, supposedly from different countries, they shared a very touching moment when the Colombian Indigenous lawyer became emotional and the Canadian Indigenous person tapped her shoulder as a gesture of solidarity. And in that moment, as a lawyer in exile, uprooted from my native land of Kurdistan, I felt that hand on my shoulder. I felt that gesture very deeply. It was an emotional moment. After the session, Alex, who is one of the panelists today, was at that time on the advisory committee of ARI. We had a conversation about the similarities between, let's say, Turkish state policy against Kurds and Canada's policies against Indigenous people. And she shared her perspective, which led us to plan this session. And then I took it to the advisory committee. Later, they all confirmed that. And Alex and I delved in deeper into the subject, from which I learned a lot. Thank you, Alex, for that. She shared resources regarding Indigenous-Newcomer allyship, including one article and one report that we will discuss today. I shared them with my colleagues who are part of the OCASI Indigenous Solidarity Group, some of whom are here today. I have learned much from these dialogues with Alex, but one thing I want to share is that Alex told me truth and reconciliation is not just about reading a land acknowledgement or inviting an elder to do a prayer. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has already collected all these narratives, wrote like thousands of pages of reports, and there is an list of action plans. We need to act. We need to go, like, as non-Indigenous people, we need to go beyond hearing these issues or like, reading acknowledgements. So that's why I want to clarify that our non-Indigenous peoples responsible from the colonialism, as we are settlers on this land as well, which Alex will be discussing. But I want to clarify that not having an elder today was not an oversight. It was intentional because we thought our webinars and roundtables are usually like an hour and a half, max 2 hours. We do not want an elder to come here and we tell the elder, you have 10 minutes to do, prayer. It felt like it will be disrespectful to limit their time. So we agreed to that. We decided to take responsibility for understanding this important subject and how we can go beyond land acknowledgement. Let's now let's narrow our focus on today's discussion. In today's global context, many individuals seeking refuge are forced to leave their native lands due to various reasons like persecution, war, or famine, seeking safety in the land now known as Canada. However, newcomers may lack knowledge about the indigenous people who have stewarded this land for thousands of years. We believe that settlement sector workers and sponsors could play a crucial role in decolonizing newcomers' perspective of indigenous people. Today, we aim to address the questions such as, what are the expectations of indigenous people from newcomers? What does it mean for the refugee-serving sector to be an ally to indigenous peoples? What is the significance of truth and reconciliation, and how does it impact both newcomers and settlement workers? What roles and responsibilities do newcomers and settlement workers have in contributing the reconciliation efforts? We will explore these questions and more with our exceptional panelists. Okay, let's meet our panelists. I will briefly introduce all of our speakers and then leave the floor to them for their presentations. Our first speaker is Alex Reynolds. Alex is a Red River Métis and settler Scottish and French, currently living in Treaty 2 territory in Manitoba. Alex's personal, academic, and professional interests have centered equally on refugee issues and Indigenous cultural regeneration in both the Canadian and global context, with a keen interest on the natural allyship and common ground between the two. Alex currently works as the Communication and Outreach Coordinator for the Sponsorship Agreement Holders Association. In this capacity, she has been working since 2021 to support the truth and reconciliation work of the association as well as its member organizations, and is currently on the advisory committee for the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, NNCTR. Alex's interests center on reconciliation and healing within Indigenous communities, namely within her own Métis community, applied decolonization, putting reconciliation into action, and building relationship of understanding between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and working specifically to encourage Indigenous refugee allyship and solidarity. Our second speaker is Chizuru Nobe-Ghelani. Chizuru is a racialized migrant settler who is originally from rural Japan. She is currently an assistant professor at the School of Social Work, Renison University College, University of Waterloo. Her scholarship and pedagogy are informed by extensive social work practice in the area of health and well-being with migrant communities, both locally and internationally. She is committed to decolonizing reflexive, relational, and community-engaged research, and is passionate about fostering better relationship between lands, newcomers, and First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our third speaker is Mbalu. Mbalu is currently the Director of Programs and Newcomer Services at the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. She's a provincial director at the Ontario Council Agency Serving Immigrants, OCASI, and has over 2 decades of experience in the immigration and refugee sector. She is passionate about social justice, human rights, decolonization, and accountability by non-Indigenous racialized people. Mbalu is also pursuing her doctoral studies with her research interests in health policy, trauma, equity, and post-colonial violence. Last but not least, we have Diana Ospina joining us from the unceded traditional territories, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, known as Vancouver, and has been in the settlement sector since 2011. Diana began by teaching English to newcomers in the ELSA and LINK programs, and has held various instructional coordination, management, and senior management roles within settlement providing organizations such as ISS of BC and Mosaic. She also had the great privilege of working closely with community in her role in community services at the Métis Nation of British Columbia. She is currently the Senior Manager of the Surrey Local Immigration and Partnership and Collaboration at DIVERSEcity Community Resources Society, where she oversees a number of community convening and capacity building projects. After this long introduction, I want to hand it over to our first panelist, Alex, by asking her, Alex, what critical reflections and groundwork should the settlement sector undertake as it considers its responsibility towards truth and reconciliation? Please unmute yourself and go ahead.
Miigwech, Marseille Metin, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen before I begin. And hopefully you can all see that. Thumbs up if you can. Perfect, thank you. Kanche tout le monde. Bonjour, indinoe maganadog. Agamayi mishike minise. Mong digije bawan indego. Mong indodam. Alex Reynolds and Dishnika Zigaye. Nimisko zi be wisakudekwe. Kadiad Rivad Makiver Nindish Kwinikaz. Nindanaku Bajiganag Beon Jiba Misko zi be basadina. Binde Jawani Manitoba. So hello everyone and greetings to all my relations who are joining us today from all across Turtle Island. The name by which the spirits know me is Loon in the Morning Mist, and I'm from the Loon clan. The name my parents gave me is Alex Reynolds. I'm Red River Métis. My Métis ancestral names are Kadiad, Rivard, and McIver. I'm also Franco-Manitoban from French ancestors who were French by blood, but Métis in their hearts, minds, and family connections, and their Métis kin embraced them as such, back before settlers started to flood here into the Northwest. Those Franco-Manitoban family names are Lagimodiad, No, and Landry. I'm also settler Scottish, bearing the names of Reynolds and Rutherford. I come from the Red River Valley, the traditional lands of my Métis ancestors in the very southernmost part of Manitoba, the area governed today by Treaty 1. So let's take a closer look at where I am exactly on this land by showing you the big picture. And here I am in around the Winnipeg area, right at the heart of the continent, the heart of Turtle Island, another in-between space where we Métis people come from. I'm going to zoom in on this area of southern Manitoba to give you a closer look at the area where my Métis ancestors come from here in the Red River Valley. So the Red River Valley extends south between Winnipeg and Pembina, North Dakota. The Red River runs north through Winnipeg to Lake Winnipeg here. And this is the area where my specific Métis ancestors came from and were rooted, even though they roamed the whole Métis nation territory, which extends from the western parts of Ontario all the way to the Rocky Mountains and up towards the Northwest Territories. We were a semi-nomadic people. So this is where my ancestors especially settled in, right at the forks where the Red River and the Assiniboine rivers meet in present-day Winnipeg, also known as Gaokosing in Anishinaabe. And my relatives also settled here, in particular around Mbalu. And I lived there a long time too, but now I live up here about 2.5 hours northwest of Winnipeg. And I'm going to zoom in a little closer on that area and tell you a little bit about where I come from and where I'm talking to you from today. So this area here is actually up in Treaty 2 territory. We're nestled here between Lake Manitoba and Riding Mountain National Park. As you can see, there's lots of green on this map. We are close here to a lot of wild places. We are blessed with a lot of beautiful forests and natural environment, a lot of wildlife, and it's a really beautiful place to live. The area here is largely populated by Indigenous folks, Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, and also Métis people, and also people of Ukrainian descent. And there's an interesting, very interesting history and interrelationship worthy of its own discussion between Indigenous people here and Ukrainian settlers who came to this area. I'm in this area right here around Alonza, Manitoba, and I'm right between Sandy Bay, Ojibwe First Nation, and Ebb and Flow, Ojibwe First Nation, two Ojibwe First Nations that have completely different histories, although both, like almost all Indigenous communities across Canada, rooted in forced migration. They are not here in these areas because they wanted to be, but because they were put there. In between these two First Nations is Métis country. And it's really customary to have Métis communities bordering First Nations communities. You see, the Red River Métis were almost completely dispossessed of our land. We don't have reserves. And as many Métis folks were either too visibly Indigenous to assimilate into white European communities and not considered treaty band members to live on reserve. So Métis people tend to live on the fringes. That's why we were referred to as the road allowance people, living in the scraps and the bits of lands in between. We've always very much been an in-between people. So a few things I just want to point out about this area where I live is that a lot of folks here still live a traditional lifestyle, hunting, fishing, trapping. So there's a whole network of informal roadways, I like to call them, and trails that you can get everywhere in this area by ATV or skidoo in the winter. It's also a place where if you go to the corner store up the road, you're just as likely to hear Anishinaabe or Michif spoken in addition to English. So it's a really special place to live, and I hope that it gives you a bit of an idea of where I'm coming from and the community I live in. So the RE roundtables aim to gather saws and SPOs together for presentations and discussions on common areas of interest to both. The topic of truth and reconciliation and the settlement sector's responsibility towards truth and reconciliation is an especially pressing and important topic. Looking at the attendance today, it looks like a great many of you agree. I want you to know that while working in truth and reconciliation can be challenging and frustrating at times, when I see how many of you are willing to show up, it really lifts up my heart and my hopes. And I know all of you have a million things that are fighting for your attention, but making time and space for learning and listening is the first important action that each one of us can take towards reconciliation. So to all of you, I extend a kichimegwich, a huge thank you for showing up to this important conversation. Since joining the SAW Association in 2021, I've had the real privilege of working to support the truth and reconciliation work of the association and engage our member organizations across the country, many of whom I know are here with us today. I've also had the pleasure of working together with these other fine individuals who are joining me on this panel today, Mbalu, Chizuru, Diana, to launch a project called the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, or the NNCTR. This session today is not about the NNCTR, but I do want to mention it now for anyone who may not be familiar, and because I'm going to reference it at points during my talk today, so you'll know what I'm talking about. So there's much keen interest in truth and reconciliation across the settlement sector, but most of us working in silos without a lot of resources or guidance trying to navigate an extremely tricky landscape. One of the main goals of the NNCTR is to bring the settlement sector together from coast to coast to coast to take into a supportive community of practice, primarily a community of practice where we can come together to take ownership and responsibility over our collective learning, and where we can have critical and reflexive discussions amongst ourselves and with Indigenous people about our responsibilities towards truth and reconciliation, and what it really means and looks like to be in allyship and in solidarity with Indigenous people. So my talk today is going to hone in on two key points: taking ownership and responsibility over our collective learning, and having critical and reflexive discussions amongst ourselves about our responsibilities towards truth and reconciliation. It's a bit of like some of the groundwork, the important groundwork that we need to do before we launch into our truth and reconciliation efforts. And it'll ultimately make those efforts more successful. So I want to point out at this point an article that I will reference, and I'm drawing a lot of ideas from. So I want to bring it up here for you now, because especially when it comes to some of the self-reflection that needs to be done within the settlement sector, this article to me that was co-authored by Mbalu and Chizuru, to me, it does an excellent job of highlighting the important questions that the settlement sector needs to be asking itself. I would like every single individual working in the settlement sector to read this article. I would like each one of you to take this article home, to read it several times, to bring it to your work, to your colleagues, to organize discussions, set time aside to have conversations within your organizations about this article and some of the real critical questions it's asking you to ask. I'm sure Metin will share the article if it hasn't been in the chat. I can't see, but I trust Metin will get it to you. But you can just Google the title and it'll come up online for you right there. So I'm first going to talk about how we need to take some ownership for our own learning within the settlement sector, and about some important groundwork that we all need to do as we embark on this journey. And then I'm going to talk about some of the hard questions we need to be asking ourselves and each other so that we can do this work in a good way. But before I go headlong into that, there are a few more things I need to say about myself and my positioning as an Indigenous person, so you can all have a better idea about where I'm coming from. So, as I mentioned, I'm Red River Métis, but I'm also settler Scottish and French. So you'll find that sometimes I say we, as in we Indigenous people, and sometimes I'll say we, as in we settlers, because I'm both. So for those of you who may be Indigenous people from lands you left behind to come to Canada, I'm sure you can relate to that, both being Indigenous and also a settler. It can be a complicated space to be in. So my commitment and passion for truth and reconciliation is rooted in my ancestors, and I really come by it honestly. You see, the Métis people have been facilitating the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people since our ethnogenesis, when the Métis people sprung up from the land and formed a new nation and of people known by several names. We are known as the French Métis, the Michif, or as the Cree call us, Otepemisiwak, the people who own themselves, and the flower beadwork people for our distinctive flower beadwork designs. So I've always felt that being Métis and having a foot in both worlds was a very privileged position, allowing me to slip into the spaces in between and to pick up the dropped threads of the broken relationships within the Métis community itself, the broken relationships between First Nations and Métis people who were once family before colonialism divided us in an attempt to conquer us, as well as the dropped threads and the broken relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here on Turtle Island. So to weave these threads of our broken relationships back together, saying that makes me think of the traditional multicolored sashes that the Métis are known for weaving, like the ones my mother makes. And I really like that symbolism. But I also want to be very clear that I'm no expert. There are very few experts on this new path towards reconciliation that we are forging, that winds its way through very tricky landscape. I'm just a Métis Ikwe, a Métis woman, and we each bring our own unique lived experiences as Indigenous people to these conversations. And we each have received knowledge and teachings from our elders that guide and shape our paths. And some of those pathways we walk may look different, but they are all headed in the same direction. So I speak primarily from the perspective of the Métis, and more specifically, the Red River Métis. I'm also informed by my connections within the Anishinaabe community or the Ojibwe community. But also, I speak to you as a non-racialized, non-visibly Indigenous person who has spent the last 25 years of my life reconnecting with my heritage, my culture, and my own indigeneity. That's because, like many Indigenous people, I was not born and raised connected to my culture. I became disconnected because my mother was adopted out of the Métis community. Others became disconnected because of the residential school system or the 60s scoop, both of which stole children and shattered families, or due to the shame and violence that caused people to hide their heritage to protect themselves. So I was really lucky. I reconnected with my Métis family back in 1998. My mother got to have a relationship with her mother for 15 years before my grandmother passed away. But not all Indigenous people find their way home so easily, and some not at all. So because I have connections to historical figures and coming from some family as the same family as Louis Riel, the leader of the Red River Resistance, my genealogy was readily available and I could get the right colonial paperwork. So I've now spent most of my, more of my life connected than disconnected. And it's only having crossed that point that I could even give myself permission to speak publicly as a Métis person and to own that identity. So of course, I'm also only one Indigenous voice. And in no way could I ever speak on behalf of all Indigenous people. No one is capable of that. And that's because our Indigenous community is just too diverse. So that's a bit about me and the particular perspective that I'm speaking from. And I want to get into the main topics of my talk today. And I want to talk to you, as I mentioned, about some of the real important groundwork that we need to be doing really before we jump to the reconciliation part of building relationships with Indigenous folks. And the first thing I want you to think about is, and this draws off of the article I mentioned, but this question of settler versus guest. So a settler is an individual who states that they are on stolen land. They might know whose traditional territory they are on, and they might wish to be a good ally. But usually a settler's intentions stop there. But a guest, on the other hand, understands through a reflexive and thoughtful process that as a guest, they have responsibilities. The guest learns the history and the current story of the land that they are guests on. They politicize that understanding. They listen to and learn protocols which do not appropriate but unsettle the privilege of ignorance. The guest is an active and respectful individual who recognizes their privilege and uses that privilege in a way that does not center themselves, but centers the community. So I really want you to think about whether you are taking on the responsibility and coming from a place of being a guest here on Turtle Island or a settler. So looking a bit more deeply, the guest's responsibility, simply put, is a responsibility that comes with being a guest on this land. Understanding ourselves as complicit with settler colonialism, taking up the responsibility to educate our communities about Indigenous histories on the lands that we reside on, prioritizing active support for Indigenous self-determination, steering away from seeking greater recognition from a colonial system and go beyond demanding citizenship rights from a settler state. So newcomer serving organizations, they should engage in conversations about what concrete steps you can take in your own context towards being a guest rather than a settler. So some other areas that are really important to keep in mind, really to inform us and guide us into how we do this work so we can do it in a good way. And the first thing I want you to consider is that the work of truth and reconciliation requires a brave space because the medicine we're working with is discomfort. When I started doing this work, we talk a lot about safe spaces because we know we all have to carry our own traumas and life events that have shaped us. And we know we want to treat people with kindness and be gentle and respectful. But the thing is that when we come into the space of truth and reconciliation, we need more than that. We need a brave space. And that's, again, because the medicine we're working with is discomfort. We can't disrupt the way colonialism, we can't dismantle colonialism, we can't change the ways we have been conditioned to operate and believe without some discomfort. It's going to be a bit unsettling. And so we really need to, I like to say that it's the medicine of discomfort because it plays such an important role. When we feel discomfort, when we hear things that make us filled up with that feeling of, ooh, I'm really uncomfortable here. You all know that feeling. And it's not a feeling to run away from. I've been taught that it's a feeling we need to run towards. And it's not a feeling we need to be afraid of because it simply tells us that we need to stop, we need to reconsider. It points us into the direction of what we need to reconsider, and we need to have a conversation. So that's all that it's telling us. So we shouldn't run away from it or be afraid. It's also important to note that we need brave spaces because in this work, there is no such thing as a safe space for Indigenous people. By becoming involved in these conversations, we are inherently putting ourselves at risk. We are working to make you feel uncomfortable. And so in doing that, we're put at risk of how you might react to that, your defensiveness. We are often having to point out to people ways they could do things better. No one is going to do everything right. We're all going to make mistakes in this process. But Indigenous people who work in this take on a special obligation to hold people to account. And sometimes we're having to hold our leadership in our organizations to account, and et cetera. And this all puts us at risk. And not only to that kind of risk, but also the risk that exists from lateral violence from within our own Indigenous communities. And that's a big problem. And it's one that every elder, knowledge keeper, and grassroots activist who speaks publicly encounters almost every single day. So these are all risks and why we require a brave space and to embrace the medicine of discomfort. And that's one of the first things I want you to hold in your mind as you're doing this work. The second, as Metin already alluded to, is to understand, as Justice Murray Sinclair said in the Truth and Reconciliation report, that it's not the responsibility of Indigenous people to reconcile with non-Indigenous people. As Indigenous people, it's our responsibility to reconcile with ourselves and with our communities, to heal, to reconnect with our communities, to reconnect with our languages, our land, and our ceremonies. So we need Indigenous people to take on more of the hard work. Because right now, from what I can see, too much of the work of reconciliation is falling on Indigenous people. An example of that is we have the day September 30th, Truth and Reconciliation Day, or Orange Shirt Day. And leading up to that day, Indigenous people are hugely drawn off of to be voices at events, to help plan events. A lot of the times we are the ones organizing the events, and it needs to be the other way around. And it needs to be not just on one day a year or 2 days a year, but all the time and throughout all the years, or throughout all the year. So I want to ask you to start by owning your responsibility for your own learning. I want you to lean on each other, and instead of leaning too hard on Indigenous people to teach you and educate you. We don't and shouldn't have to take you by the hand. I want you to lean on all the plentiful resources that are out there, that our people have already poured so much of their personal stories and knowledge into. The Truth and Reconciliation report is full of firsthand accounts of residential school experiences. There are documentaries, films, television series, books. No matter what kind of medium interests you most, there is something for you. But what you need to do is to make the time to learn about it. And that, I think, is one of the things that's most lacking, because that learning isn't going to take place in these 2-hour sessions. It really depends on you making space in your day to tune in to a podcast on Indigenous issues, to follow some grassroots Indigenous voices so that you're hearing from them on a regular basis. So I really want to see non-Indigenous folks take that responsibility for their own learning and to dedicate more of that serious time and energy to internal critical self-reflection, whether that's personal or within your organizations. I would also like to see a focus on going to Indigenous people, coming to our communities, coming out to our land and in our ceremonies, rather than only inviting us into colonized spaces, spaces that are devoid of the critical connection and relationship to land that is so essential to true reconciliation. Now, Metin again also referenced and spoke a little bit to this in reference to this particular session today, but I really want you to consider, as he did, that our elders and knowledge keepers are true treasures, and there is absolutely no measure that can adequately summarize their value and the value of their knowledge. They are immensely important to the healing of our people, and they bear a great burden of responsibility in that to our communities and helping to heal and reconnect our people. And so I want, really to emphasize this idea, that of course, non-Indigenous people need to hear from our elders and knowledge keepers. It's fundamental. I encourage you to reach out to them in their spaces and on their land and in their ceremonies. But I also really want you to be mindful of the amount of time and space that you give them to speak, and make sure that you are prepared to listen. Our elders can tell a lot of stories, and sometimes it can be hard to understand the connection of those stories. And we need to listen really, really, really closely. And sometimes we won't even understand in the moment what the message is. I know some stories I've heard and received from my elders, it took several years before one day it popped into my head, oh, that's what he was talking about. But we are losing our elders too at a really truly shocking pace sometimes. I know for me, I can count on my fingers the number of critical and important elders and knowledge keepers who have invested in me with their knowledge, who are no longer with us. So I really just want to emphasize how important they are, and that you give some real thought as to the why and how you bring them in to speak. And these conversations, I also want to emphasize, are especially important at the local level in our local communities. So hearing from those elders and knowledge keepers who live on the land you live on, they have critical information for you, and you need to go and listen to them. So again, I talk about going out, coming to us, to our communities out on the land, because one of the things that's really missing from the conversation around truth and reconciliation, we talk about Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, but there's a third party to the relationship and the conversation, and that's the land itself. So reconciliation will not be possible unless all of us reconcile our relationship with the land and the natural world, and assume the position in that web of relation that human beings are supposed to live in, and which we have become fundamentally disconnected from. So reconciliation with Indigenous people cannot be separated from reconciliation with the land. And so unless we're going out on the land to do this learning, then we're missing a huge part of the story. It's not going to happen in meeting rooms inside the city, because those are inherently non-Indigenous colonized spaces, and they are devoid of the land that needs to be present. So the other thing I want to mention is that we really need to understand how important relationship building is to this process, and that relationship building takes time. It takes a lot of time. How an organization, how one of your organizations might reach out to another partner in the sector to initiate a project, that approach, that the status quo approach, is not likely going to work very well if you're trying to reach out to Indigenous communities. You need to take time to build those relationships. I'm here today speaking with you because of relationship. My relationship to the ARI project and the advisory committee for ARI, my relationship with Metin, our conversations at the CCR conference last year, our further conversations around this session. So this is relationship, and this is why I am here talking to you today as opposed to somebody else, because we had that pre-existing relationship. So some other things that are really important and fundamental: we need from you actions and not words. We have heard hundreds of years of words, and those words have amounted to nothing. So unless you can tell us about the actions you are taking, then we're going to have a hard time having any faith in you. And this is a bit of a problem, especially when it comes to land acknowledgements, because all too often I'm seeing people limit their actions to land acknowledgements, or thinking that a land acknowledgement is action, but it's not. It's just words. So to elevate your land acknowledgements, because I do agree, they are an important settler ally practice. And I love how they call us to think about Indigenous people in spaces we normally would not. So I think that's really important. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge the land and the territories that we're on. But there's two things that Indigenous folks need to hear in your land acknowledgements? Because I will say in my circles, and when Indigenous folks talk about land acknowledgements, they don't have a lot of positive things to say. And two of the main things they'll highlight as missing is, number one, a real explicit acknowledgement of the truth. And it's understandable that unless you know the entire truth of what's happened here on Turtle Island to Indigenous people and the magnitude of the violence that's been exacted upon us, then it might be hard for you to understand, the real bare bones truth and incorporate it in your land acknowledgements. But here's one thing that's simple. All the time I hear the word unceded land. We live, laugh, and play on unceded territory. What does unceded mean? It means stolen. So let's say that. Let's say that we're on stolen lands. And let's talk about some of what has come from the fact that those lands have been stolen. Let's acknowledge that and not just the territory. We also need to hear your actions. If your land acknowledgement does not speak to the actions that you are taking, either as an individual or as an organization, then it's empty words. So you want to do the work. You need to do the work, and you need to come to us and tell us what your actions are. What are you doing? I learned Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe language, and one of the things you quickly realize is that language, and it speaks, I think, to what's important to the Ojibwe people, is that the language is entirely verb-based. It's entirely action-based. If you want to invent a new word, you verb it. You turn it into an action. And that's how we invent new words in that language. So I think that speaks a lot to what's important to Anishinaabe people in particular, and that's action. And I think that that's something that's important to all Indigenous people. The other thing is truth before reconciliation. We talk a lot about reconciliation, and I think we have this human tendency to want to run before we can walk, to get to the good stuff, the meet and greets, the community feasts where we get to hear each other and our stories, all of those good things that can come from us, the newcomer settlement sector and the Indigenous community coming together in relationship. But we can't get there without acknowledging the truth. And the only way that you can understand the truth is by educating yourself. And so you need to understand, you need to take the time to do that reading, listening, learning, to understand the magnitude of the violence that's been enacted. We are talking here on Turtle Island about 500 years of trying and attempts to eradicate Indigenous people. When we look at the residential school system that started in 1831 and ran for 165 years, followed by the 60s scoop, where thousands of Indigenous children were stolen from their families by the child welfare system and adopted out into non-Indigenous communities. That hasn't changed. Today, the child welfare system is apprehending Indigenous children at the bedside after their mothers give birth. There are reports from Indigenous women of forced sterilizations. There are more Indigenous kids in the hands of the government today than ever before. So we really need to think about that. That's 200 years of stealing children. 200 years, not just a dark period or a few bad years where a lot of people suffered. This is generations and generations and generations. So we also need to understand that there is a heart to the matter. There is a core to this problem. We can sometimes look at the situation of Indigenous people in this country, and it can be really overwhelming because there are so many issues just all over the map, from the intergenerational impact and fallout of residential schools, the broken families, to the lack of drinking water in communities, to missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, to 80% of the kids in care are Indigenous, 80% of those incarcerated, Indigenous. Like, the problems are overwhelming, but there's one root, and it makes it real simple. And that heart of the problem is stolen lands. And I want to show you this to illustrate it. So this, of course, is Canada. It's a map of all the Indigenous territories. I love how they overlap so much. But this is pre-contact. All of Turtle Island was in the hands of Indigenous people. All of Turtle Island and its plentiful resources. But what happened today? This is what we have left. 99.8% of the land and its resources in the hands of Canada. 0.2, not even 0.5% left in the hands of Indigenous people. This doesn't include Métis people. This just includes First Nations. So this tells you the root of the problem. How can we solve all of these problems in our communities? How can we heal our communities when we have no resources to work with? And it's also important to keep in mind that those resources are what give Canada its wealth. And that wealth is what allows it to receive newcomers. We would not be receiving newcomers if it wasn't for that fact. So newcomers are able to come to Canada thanks to the resource extraction from stolen Indigenous lands. And that's a tough, uncomfortable thing to think about, but we need to think about it. This gives you just a bit more of a visual representation of what we're lacking. And I speak to this, this is Christy Belcourt, one grassroots Métis artist and activist who I follow. And here she ties it together. Canadians need to connect the dots between residential schools and resource extraction, between child welfare and resource extraction, between missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirits and resource extraction. It's always been about the land. And of course, resource extraction has been at the heart of the colonial endeavor everywhere on this planet that colonialism has touched. So that message is at the heart of this book. And if I had to point to one book for you to start with, that I would point to the Reconciliation Manifesto by Arthur Manuel. Arthur Manuel was a grassroots Indigenous activist from out in BC. You can learn about him in this book, and I encourage you. There's another book he wrote called Unsettling Canada. He's no longer with us, but just before he passed away, he wrote the manifesto, and it was like him leaving a message to us. So check out that book. I want to also mention briefly the idea of cultural humility and decolonization, and really pointing to this idea that of all the different definitions of decolonization, I really want to hone in on this idea that we challenge the superiority of Western thought and approaches, because that's really what decolonization means. It doesn't mean stopping the way you do or think about things, but setting that aside and creating space for other ways of living, being, knowing, thinking that have been excluded by colonialism. And by doing that and opening up that space, we also benefit from the enormous knowledge that we as human society have lost thanks to the efforts of colonialism to put it aside. And I would argue that some of that wisdom is really essential to us right now at this critical juncture we humans find ourselves in, having to adapt to a changing climate and a devastated natural world. So again, I also want to turn back to the article I mentioned and what it asks of you as a settlement sector, this critical reflexivity, which sounds like a complicated word, but it's really just asking you to look inwards and look at yourselves critically and think about how you operate can reinforce power relations, and how we can become complicit in the process of marginalization and oppression of Indigenous people and other oppressed and colonized people. So this is great, and I'm getting close to wrapping up here, but these are some of the really important questions that that article asks. And I think we really need to start having discussions internally at our organizations about this. So some of that is, what are our obligations? What do we have? What obligations do we have towards Indigenous people as settlers, resettling settlers on stolen lands? What does that mean for the settlement sector? Are all migrants in the category of settlers when some migrants come to Canada due to the impacts of colonization elsewhere? Are people of color settlers too? Not all migrants are economic migrants who come to Canada. Some newcomers are Indigenous to the lands they left behind, and that may even be the reason for their migration to Canada. How can they maintain their indigeneity in a new land? How can we disrupt colonial narratives and practices by applying Indigenous knowledge and practices into our work? And this last is what my colleagues Mbalu and Chizuru are going to speak to a bit in their presentations. So it makes a good place to segue and hand over the mic to them. But I just want to leave you here quickly with the website for the National Newcomer Collective for Truth and Reconciliation, because it is a place, we hope, to be able to come together and ask and discuss all these challenging questions so that you're not alone in asking and considering them. We're all here to do it together. So I'll leave you with the website so you can visit and learn more. It's in a development, a work in progress. So you'll find information there on how to join. And we have a collective meeting coming up next Tuesday, June 11th. So get in touch and join in on that meeting if you want to continue this conversation there with us. So miigwech to all of you again, Marseille to Metin and to Ari Project and OCASI for organizing this session today, and for all of you for your time and for listening.
Wow. Thank you very much, Alex. Excellent presentation. Okay, I know you have questions. I have questions too, but we will get to questions in the last 15-20 minutes. Maybe I will hand it over to Mbalu and Chizuru with the question of, how did CCVT get started with truth and reconciliation work? Mbalu, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think I have no words to describe what Alex has presented, and has really brought lots of ideas in terms of how much work we still have to do. But her presentation is very powerful, and I don't even know how to pick up from there. But I think before we actually talk about our experience with truth and reconciliation, I would like maybe Chizuru, who has been working with CCVT for many years, to start off to talk about the research that really helped guide the work that we're doing, and also how she was able to connect us with Elder Norma Jacob, who has really helped in every step of our learning, unlearning, and relearning as we go through truth and reconciliation efforts. So Chizuru, I think it'll be best if you start, and then I'll pick up and speak specifically in terms of the work of CCVT and the journey that we're taking.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Mbalu. And I first want to thank you, Alex, for really beautiful, important teaching that you generously shared with us. I also want to thank the Martin for organizing this panel and for everyone to come, and Mbalu and Indiana to be on journey together as collective. If it's possible, can you pull up my slide, please?
Sure.
Thank you. So I would like to briefly, before I get in, so my name is Chizuru. It means 1,000 cranes in my language. I'm a settler from rural Japan. And Chizuru 1,000 symbolize the peace in my language. So I've always tried to embrace the meaning of my name, peace, into all the relationships that I have with people and in communities, but also non-human communities. So the project that I was honored to lead with Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture is entitled Renewing Relationship with Local Lands, an exploration of Indigenous and refugee relations with the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. So this project really came about as I was completing my doctoral research that examined Canada's investment on colonizations and how that really shaped the newcomer settlement. And I was actually working as in a sector before I did my PhD with Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. So as I was wrapping up my doctoral research and thinking about Canadian citizenship, what that means in relations to newcomer serving sector, as well as the relationship to Indigenous people. I really wanted to think a bit more, and I wanted to think with community. And that's how it kind of led back to CCVT. And I had suggested to Executive Director Mulugeta Bai to see if we could do some community action research with me. And I was nervous about, approaching him, but he was very, very generously agreeable to this project. And I got reconnected with Mbalu, who has been extremely wonderful partner in this project. So the article that Alex has shared, it came about from my doctoral research, but also my conversation with Mbalu. And as we are trying to think through how we could do this in a meaningful way, we came up, so that paper is really about our reflection. So we thought about the role of refugee community in the truth and reconciliation. It led us to think about, rethinking of refugee integrations. What does a decolonizing citizenship look like? All those themes that we addressed in that paper came from the conversations. And so as we started thinking about that and also designing our project, I have approached my friend and colleague, Dr. Timothy Leduc, who does a lot of land-based inquiry into Indigenous and settler relations. And then Dr. Leduc invited Cayuga Elder Guy Hoanko, Norma Jacobs from the Six Nations to join us to this project. And we've decided that two-role approach was most appropriate to this project. So that's how we began to start this project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the key question that this project addressed was, how does the refugee integration look like when local Indigenous history, presence, and knowledge were considered? And this project really focused on the land history and learning in the context of Toronto, traditional territories of Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Wendat, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. And because of Elder Norma's background, most of the teaching was provided from the Haudenosaunee perspective. Next slide, please. Okay, so I will briefly explain how we did this project in case some others might want to do something similar. So we did the preparation phase, which included orientations and pre-circle focus group. So I did that with CCVT staff and clients. Even before I get to the point, I did a lot of relationship building with CCVT. You know, because even though I used to work at the center, I didn't expect that they have trust in me. And so it was important for me as a community researcher to have the relationship back, to do a lot of work for them as well at the same time as I was trying to launch this project. And after the preparation phase, we went into the key aspect of this project, which was learning and a sharing phase. And this was done by Dr. the Elder Noma and Dr. Tim Leduc. They co-facilitated the circle, and I was there to document. I was a participant, but I also documented the learning from each participant. And we also had the phase of the reflection phase, which included a focus group with the participants and also CCVT as a whole organization. We had 8 participants from CCVT, so 3 staff and 5 clients. So it's quite small, but in a way it was intentional because this circle takes a lot of reflections and deep listening and sharing. We wanted to keep it small, and then also this was designed as a pilot project. So that's the reason of the smaller number. I thought really carefully about how to include clients, given the histories of the CCVT clients may bring. So I engaged with the CCVT counselors before and then after the circle, just to check in on the clients who are participating in this project. And I also wanted to mention that this project was first imagined as a land-based project. So we wanted to do every session on the land. But then this was actually just as the pandemic hit. So we had to shift to the virtual platform. Next slide, please. So here are the topics that I have covered. So we started from the Thanksgiving address and then traditional Haudishane welcoming of people from other lands. So this is where Elder Noma shared, Thanksgiving address, and it was a wonderful start to open up the circle. And then we moved on to Two-Row in Indigenous Toronto. So you see the Two-Row wampum belt on the right. And this Elder Noma and then Dr. Leduc went into explaining the intent of this wampum belt and treaties that they've had, but then also went into the how settlers have broken that treaties. And then we went on to discuss the colonial history, residential school, missing and modern Indigenous women and girls. Then we moved on to having a conversation about plant medicine, naturalizing land relations. And then we had a wrap up of the virtual session, which was on setting our intentions and values. And finally, in May 2022, after almost 2 years, we began the project. We had in-person sessions at High Park. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I just wanted to, there was many reflection that came from this project, right? And I really resonated when Alex mentioned, truth before reconciliation. And in fact, that was our motto of this project. We said, let us find out more about truth before we can even start thinking about relationship building, before we can even start the reconciliation. So really, the big aspect of this project was, educating ourselves, and we just got extremely fortunate to have Elder Noma and then Dr. Luke to be part of this project. I just want to share three themes that came out from the reflections that I feel like that's relevant to your work, our work for the newcomer serving sector. The first one is a diversity as resistance. So this theme was really important to me to kind of think about this. As I mentioned, the project took the two role model, and along with how Elder Noma and Dr. Leduc offer their own teaching from their own unique positions, they encourage us to think about Elder Noma's Haudishane teaching in relations to our own cultural and ancestral teaching. And this was very effective in our group because, it was a reminder that our own diverse cultural and ancestral teaching can offer anti-colonial possibility. So I want to share one of the quotes that kind of symbolize this. And it says, I think the part of the spirit of two role is that we have to remember our love for our own culture so that we don't cross the water. I like this quote because it's quite powerful, I have to say. In our current immigrants and refugee integrations, newcomers were expected to, follow the script of success that put whiteness as a standard of goodness. So our cultural diversity and our own way of knowing are not acknowledged beyond the rhetoric of multiculturalism. So the participants are able to have an opportunity to think about how their own cultural and ancestral teaching can offer the strong foundation for truth and reconciliations and good relationship with Indigenous communities in the land here. The second reflection I want to share is the interplay of settler colonialism, global imperialism, and gender violence. And this theme came out strongly, especially during the session when we discussed the colonial histories in session 3. This topic was, as you can imagine, quite heavy for many participants because many of them also experienced colonialism that pushed them out of their own lands. And as they reflected on Elder Noma's teaching, many noted the connection between colonialism here and colonialism there. I want to share the quote again. It goes, colonialism here and colonialism back home, they're not separate. I came here because of colonialism, but I see colonialism here too. I find myself stuck with colonization, and all our misery started from colonization, right? And even though this quote does not capture it, there was also a theme of gender violence that comes with colonialism and how women's body became a battlefield. So again, going back to missing modern Indigenous women and girls, that really resonated to some of the participants that we had. And then final point of the key reflection is the Indigenous people and the land as a host. And this theme came out clear and clear as the project progressed. So it was one of those gradual awareness, but the deep ones. So usually in a newcomer integration programming, the host is imagined with Settler Canada, and no Indigenous communities are consulted with how newcomers are entered into the land or relationship. And I think this quote captured that element. Because the Indigenous community are not aware or informed of the immigrants or refugees or newcomers are coming to their land, who is a host really? Once again, the question may seem simple, but it's a fundamental one that can destabilize the mythology of Canada. So once again, there's so much more I would love to share, but I'm just going to be passing on to Mbalu, who will be speaking about, how CCVT took some of the learning from this project to next level. So I'm going to pass it on to you, Mbalu. Thank you.
Thank you, Chizuru. So good afternoon again. So before I jump into the how, I think I just wanted to spend a few seconds to talk about the why. Why did I choose to commit to do this? Because I think while we work for organizations, at the same time, this work requires personal commitment. For me, I think the why at the personal level is important because the experience of displacement, resource extraction is very familiar to me and my family. My family are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. So that feeling and that experience is very familiar to me. And as a guest on this land, as Alex had defined, but the term guest, but the credit goes to Ruth Colazar-Green, because in our article, we actually quoted Ruth Colazar-Green, who's an indigenous scholar who actually made that a differential between what is a guest and what is a settler. So I encourage you to read her article because that's where we got our inspiration from. But coming back to what I was saying, as a guest on this land, for many years, I did not know much about Indigenous communities. The experience of forced migration for me, I've experienced it since I was young. And being in Canada for many years, I did not know much about Indigenous communities until when I was doing my graduate studies. That's why I had to read a little bit more about Indigenous communities. And in doing so, I realized, I'm like, wow, the privilege I had and how the privilege I hold and how can I use this to shift policy and engage folks in this journey as well, because I still had to learn a lot. And one of the things that came to my mind at that time was also saying, well, I've been working in this sector for many, many years. And one of the things that I've been doing is actually engaging our service users in learning about Canada. And one of the guides, one of the materials that we've been using is a citizenship guide, right? Not at one point in my life working in the settlement sector did I question the guide, never, until I had to pursue my my graduate studies. The citizenship guide, we taught the service users about it to prepare them for citizenship, but it was very limiting. And if you open it even now, I encourage you to actually Google Discover Canada and look at it and see the narrative that is displayed there about Indigenous community. That's something that you can do as a service provider at this point. And from there, I became more curious in terms of there's more that I need to learn, but who can guide? And the timing was just perfect when Chizuru contacted our agency and our executive director, Mulugeta, said, okay, Mbalu, do you want to take the lead on this? I was more than excited because I had the curiosity. I did some research on my own. I did some readings, but I still wanted more, right? And the timing was just perfect for us to go through that process. So I say this because I think before we actually engage in this, and something going back to what Alex was saying, that critical reflection is extremely important, and that personal commitment to going through this journey is very, very important. Next slide, please. So what happened at CCVT? From the time that Chizuru contacted us, I think the first thing that we had to do is to educate our staff, to engage our staff in that process, to engage our board and make sure it's part of our strategic plan as well. I think education is a big piece. It continues to be a big piece, and I think it will continue to be playing an important role. And that education was in terms of learning about Indigenous history. And it started off just bringing Chizuru in, talking about the basic before we even brought in Elder Norma Jacob to facilitate some of the sessions and also to connect our service users and our staff into the project that Chizuru was talking about it. But ongoing professional development regarding settler colonialism and settler responsibility continues to be an ongoing part of the work that we do at the center. And one of the things that we did was to say, okay, well, we've been reading land acknowledgements, and the land acknowledgements are standardized. Everywhere you go, it's the same thing, same land acknowledgement. So we said, okay, well, I think land acknowledgement should be personal. You have to personalize it, and it has to be meaningful. It cannot just be the standard land acknowledgement. So we decided to engage our staff, our service users, to get their input in terms of how they feel that the land acknowledgement should look like, including our board. So we went back and forth and we came up with this. Next slide. So this became our land acknowledgement, and it's a contribution of the experience of our service users in their connection to the land, our board of directors, our volunteers, in terms of how we understand our relationship with the land. And this is how we've been using our land acknowledgement in events, in meetings, and it's very personalized according to the work that we do. And I think it's because our staff were involved, our board was involved in this process, and it reflects the narrative of our service users. It's personal, right? So we want our work and our commitment to truth and reconciliation to be personal, not only at the organizational level, but for it to be at the individual level as well. And one thing about this land acknowledgement is that as we were reading it, right, last year, when we were launching our report that Chizuru presented, we had service users who were present. And during the session, we finished reading it, and they waited until once we finished reading it. And two of our service users stood up and said, we appreciate the land acknowledgement, but the thing is it possible to get it in various languages? So that way we can actually fully understand, because it's in English. English is our additional language. Is it possible for us to get it in multiple languages so that we can personally relate to it? And this year, based on their feedback, we actually translated the land acknowledgement in various languages. We still haven't, we don't have it in all of our languages, but at least in more than 6 languages already, it has been translated. And if we can go to the next slide, there's a QR code. If you use your phone on this QR code, you will see the land acknowledgement in various languages. So we want to make sure that our service users are able to understand. So it's not only about reading. So when we're reading the land acknowledgement, they understand it fully. Okay. So I'll leave that, and I think we haven't put that on our website yet, but I think that will be the next step in terms of what we plan on doing. And I'll just go further as well in terms of how we've also engaged our service users. Next slide, please. As Chizuru mentioned, we've engaged in various learning workshops. The youth are the future. For those who know me, I'm very passionate about youth. And we've had one of our staff, Sambal, who has been working with our youth on a photo contest on National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The event is actually tomorrow at 2. And the youth have been working, of course, with the guidance of Elder Norma Jacob, Chizuru, and Dr. Tim Leduc, who actually guided them in this process of actually learning about climate justice. So the presentation will be tomorrow, and they will be presenting on it. And they also got we engaged our youth in civic engagement. So they met MPP, Ashlyn Clancy as well, to further understand about our ecosystem, environmental issues. And we hope that those who are in the Takaronto area, please, if you can join us tomorrow, that would be great to see some of the work and the photo contest that they've been working on. And the other item as well that we did was to talk to our language instruction staff in terms of including Indigenous content in their teachings as well, because they meet the students on a daily basis. So I think while you're teaching English, you can also include the Indigenous content there. So that's excellent. And there's a very good material that was shared with us on language instruction. I can't remember the name of the agency. It just slipped off my mind. But if you go to the website, the NNTCR, you will see tons very recently information that has been posted on language instruction materials that you can use, that your teachers can actually use to engage students to learn about truth and reconciliation. And once I remember that agency, I will actually post it here. I remember they sent it to me and it just slipped off my mind. I'll probably post it by the end of this session. And if you're here, oh, perfectly. Thank you, Chizuru. So please go to it and you will see it's very good material in terms of how to engage learners. And on the right side, you will see there is a photo by one of our youth. And the quotation really stood by me, really resonated with me. And they're saying, a harmonious ecosystem reflecting our lives, variations in seasons, emotions, gender experiences, and life stages can be seen at the TMU Urban Farm, which reflects the synergy of the First Nations tenet of four spirits at the front. Maize support the curling beanstalks, while squash leaves on the ground retain moisture, and sunflowers at the back attract pollinators. Each one of them have a purpose. The glue that holds varied people and the natural world together in perfect harmony is truth and reconciliation. So this is from one of our youth, and I thought it was really powerful. And it just shows how the importance of us working together and how the land is there to teach us. We have all the resources out there. The land is out there to take care of us. And this idea of relationality that I've learned from Elder Norma Jacob, I just want to emphasize again on the importance of that. I think today's session is not to create a binary of space, of colonizer versus colonized, of us versus them, but to really say that we need to be intentional and understand the importance of humanity. And by starting by ourselves, it means that self-reflexive effort has to pass binaries, right? We have to pass binaries, because sometimes I see that when we stay in those us versus them, we actually are complicit in creating those violent spaces, and we need to go beyond that. And when we do that, we are actually committing to transformation of social and educational context. For example, in the space that we're in right now, that's what we're doing. We're engaging in very complex dialogue, and we need to have more of these spaces, because in the spaces like this is where we actually are talking about truth, right? We're engaging in truth, no matter how discomfort it is. That's how we're learning and relearning and unlearning. Unless we create spaces like this, then we'll just keep on going in circles and complicit in settler colonialism. So that's all for me. And thank you so much. And I will pass it to Diana, who will share about her experience as well.
Thank you very much, Mbalu and Chizuru. Excellent, excellent article. I think everybody should read it, and probably we will have some questions from people who already read it. And I want to come to Diana. Diana, could you please tell us a bit about the Surrey First Peoples Guide for Newcomers projects in your speech? And I hope you are able to share your screen and unmute yourself.
Yeah,
Yes.
yes.
Perfect.
I hope I'm sharing my screen. I can't tell if I am at the moment.
Yes, we can see it, no problem.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you so much. Mitian, thank you so much for the question. And I'd also like to thank the folks at OCASI and Ari for creating this space for us to gather here. Alex really started us out in such a great way, and I'm just going to kind of move forward and talk a little bit about our project, just so you get a sense of, you know, some of the things that can happen when you start to kind of reflect on how we can do some learning about the truth, and start to work on relationship building. So I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. I know for me, it's still good morning here in Burnaby and in Surrey. My name is Diana Ospina, and I'm the Senior Manager for the Surrey LIP and Collaboration Initiatives, as was mentioned. I am a second-generation settler, and I come from family that comes from various regions in Colombia. And I think it's really important for me just to kind of state that my journey has been, I was born in Vancouver, was born and raised here. I went to school here, and I'm very much connected with, you know, the community here. So that's where I'm coming from. I'd also like to acknowledge the territory on where this work took place. It's very important, and I really love those reflections that Mbalu showed about how you can take those territorial acknowledgements and be more aware of what you're trying to do and state about your learning journey. The work of the Surrey LIP takes place on what is known as Surrey. That's the traditional and ancestral territories of the Semiahmoo, the Katzie, the Coquitlam, the Kwantlen, the Kaikot, and the Musqueam, and the Tawasin. And I really resonated with what Alex said. These are stolen lands. These are lands that have had hundreds of years of resource extraction. I have had the great privilege of being able to be on Kwantland and learn about how their population was decimated through disease even before the first settlers came. So when they came, they thought the land was pretty empty. So not true. Even today, it's incredible to me to know that Kaikot is you know, fighting to be recognized, as they were deemed extinct just at the end of the 1890s there. So the consequences of colonialism is very real here. And I've had the opportunity to connect with these communities, to continue my learning journey, and to really focus on coming to these spaces ready to learn. And I was told by an elder, there's a reason you have two ears, because that's what you need to do. You need to focus on listening before you do any of that speaking work. I think I'm going to skip by this. I don't think we have that much time for this, but basically the Surrey Local Immigration Partnership is funded by IRCC. And we are a convening body, so we convene community members in Surrey so that we can address the issues that are in our community and try to make Surrey a more welcoming place. Surrey is one of the largest cities in British Columbia, and we have more than 24 residents each day arriving, so it's a bustling place. And a lot of the work that we do is made to try to make the services that are available to newcomers and the initiatives that our community wants us to answer in a way that is accessible to the newcomers that are arriving. Okay, so my screen here is doing something funny. Sorry, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to tell you a little bit about how the Surrey First Peoples Guide for Newcomers started and then get into what it actually is. So it began when we wanted to find a way to bridge Indigenous and newcomer communities and to explore the role that newcomers to Canada have in that process of reconciliation. You know, I think we heard from Alex that she quoted Senator Murray Sinclair, where basically there was a call for us to do our own learning. One of the pieces that he said at Rideau High School in Ottawa at a graduation ceremony is, what is the role of adult newcomers to Canada in the ongoing work of reconciliation if they are not connected to this history? If you feel connected to the future of this country, then you are responsible for the future of this country, and you need to care about reconciliation for the sake of the future of this country. So it's that call again to do the work, to learn about the history, get connected to that, and understand how it's impacted this place that we call Canada and a home to so many of us. In 2028, the Fraser Region Aboriginal Friendship Centre Association, together with the Surrey LIP, we supported a series of dialogue circles between Indigenous and refugee youth. The Indigenous youth had the opportunity to learn about the history of Indigenous peoples in Canada, as well as the strengths and challenges they face in urban centres like Surrey. And I think this speaks to the fact that you know, even within our communities, the Indigenous folks are still are working to connect with their culture, their history as well. Meanwhile, the refugee youth, that team received capacity building in leadership, event planning, and storytelling so that they could work together on creating this cultural retreat. These dialogues culminated in a full-day retreat hosted by Chief Marilyn Gabriel of Kwantlen First Nation in their really beautiful longhouse that is located on the area near Fort Langley. At the retreat, the youth shared their stories, participated in various sessions such as Indigenous-led women empowerment workshops and the Kairos blanket exercise, and a refugee-led Journeys activity, which highlighted where people had traveled from and where their families were from. The experience was really eye-opening, as many of the refugee and Indigenous participants had never heard of each other's stories in this way, and the dialogue has a profound cultural experience that led to you know, new levels of solidarity, understanding, and of course that appreciation of the commonalities amongst the cultures. So after all of that work had been done, we wanted to see how could we take all of that experiential learning and that learning that had happened on the land and share that with the community in a sustainable way. And so the next stage of the journey began with the community-centered creation of the Surrey First Peoples Guide. The guide was created to provide newcomers and other community members with an accessible resource to learn about the stories and history of their Indigenous neighbors. The hope was that through the education and understanding of the common misconceptions, and I think Mbalu spoke to that, that people gain about First Peoples when they first land here could be addressed, and that we could continue to work on the bridging between Indigenous and newcomer communities. The Surrey First Peoples Guide for Newcomers is an educational resource that took, I mean, we're going on over 2 years to develop, and we still continue to revise it. The aim of the guide was to create a resource in plain language about Indigenous peoples in Canada, created from an Indigenous perspective. It has been meant to be a community resource in which learning champions can learn how to facilitate session for their peers and colleagues and amplify the messaging and the content. The guide covers a wide range of topics related to the history and challenges faced by First Nations, the Métis, the Inuit peoples in Surrey, as well as recognizing the vibrant urban Indigenous community. It also addresses common misconceptions and stereotypes about the First Peoples while celebrating the brilliance and excellence of Indigenous communities and champions in maintaining their culture. We're able to have this guide available in multiple languages, including French, Mandarin, Punjabi, Tagalog, Hindi, and Korean. And we are just on the verge of releasing our Vietnamese, Spanish, and Arabic versions as well. The guiding method that was taken was a community-centered approach in creating the guide, where we were respecting the diversity by honoring diverse Indigenous perspectives and the perspectives of newcomers in Surrey, and in this way creating pathways to kinship in which the legacy of the work continues for future generations, with where respectful relationships can be based on truth and continue to thrive. A little bit more about how the guide came to be. Extensive research and community conversations were integral to the creation of the guide, and Indigenous perspectives were prioritized and centered throughout the process. We were very blessed to be able to work with some really well-known Indigenous leaders. The project was led by Jessica Slater from the Fisher River Cree Nation and her team at Little Crane Consulting. And the illustrations and the graphics were designed by the team at Nahani Creative, which is also an Indigenous woman-led company. The project involved a community-centered approach to amplify the stories of the land-based nations, urban populations, and Indigenous champions. This included roundtable discussions that brought newcomers and Indigenous communities together, as well as very important collaborations with several Indigenous knowledge keepers and elders. We were blessed to have Chief Harley Chappelle from Semiahmoo, Chief Marilyn Gabriel from Kwantland, and Elder Philip Ladue from the Métis Nation. In 2022, the guide was recognized with the BC Recognition Award by the Office of Lieutenant General, Governor of British Columbia, and the BC Achievement Foundation. We're not in it for the awards, but we were grateful to be able to bring this to the community and to be able to use that platform to amplify it even more. And here you can see how the resource is divided. It's just a little bit of a screenshot so you can get a sense of it. If you'd like to explore the guide, it certainly is available on our website, which is surreylip.ca. But you can see that we have looked into the definition of the key terms, protocols, history, Indigenous rights and title, anti-Indigenous racism in Canada, Indigenous resurgence and brilliance, and of course, a really nice closing reflection. The guide is also accompanied by a curriculum for those who do decide to take the train the trainer model. And it has a participant workbook and a facilitator toolkit, which is used to allow champions to teach and present this content to their peers and colleagues. It's designed to create a safe space for learning, incorporating inquiry-based experiential learning techniques, logistical preparations, and understanding learning outcomes, and assessing the progress of the folks that are in your sessions. I know I had to rush through this a little bit, but if anyone has any questions about the content and how we arrived to it, please feel free. But I just wanted to also mention that taking into account all that we've heard from Alex, Mbalu, and Chizuru, this was our efforts at bringing that truth to newcomers in a way that was accessible to them, and also to help community members amplify those messages. And we want to continue doing that. So we are continuing to have a lot of these really beautiful sessions to bring the Surrey First Peoples Guide to the community. And we've also been able to connect with our colleagues and friends at FRAFCA to continue doing story sharing and story exchange activities, which we've had now for the last couple of years. And that's been very beautiful, important, and an opportunity for people to connect, which is sometimes very difficult to do because, as Alex showed you, the Indigenous population is growing very quickly, but it's not the largest population, especially not in our cities. So it's not always easy for people to connect. And we wanted to provide those opportunities from our end and also lift up those opportunities from the Indigenous community as well. So I'm going to say thank you very much. I know we want to have questions, so I'm going to just stop sharing. But again, Metienne, thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for the excellent presentation as well as the great work you are doing and your organization is doing. And I also want to thank our ASL interpreters. They agreed to stay a little longer because I know we said we will have question and answer session. And I appreciate that. Thank you, Martin and Ava. Mbalu, before we move on to question and answer session, I think you wanted to share something about the
Yes,
collective.
just briefly, in terms of next steps, because
Sure.
usually we have the sessions, we talk about things, but what can you do as a next step? And I know that Alex did talk about the collective. And if you can just share the last slide of my presentation, I just wanted to share with folks in terms of how you can be engaged and for you to see how the brilliant team got together to start the NNTCR that you actually, I don't know if folks got a chance to actually visit the website, but just to give you quickly in terms of what has been happening in terms of the NNTCR and how you can be involved in terms of sharing your ideas, your thoughts, and collectively we can all learn together. Not going to go into details. If you want access to this timeline, we can share it with you by just giving background in terms of how much time is needed, right? We started working on this project almost about 4 years back, and how it led to the NNTCR. But it started off with presentation, and then we were connected with the SA Association with Alex. And now with the collective, we've been working on getting the advisory committee to guide the work. We've applied for a few grants, and as a result, that's how we were able to launch the website that you have access today. And next week, June 11th at 3 p.m. will be our next collective meeting. So I encourage you all. This journey is not a journey to take alone. We need to do it collectively in a relational way. And that desire to work collectively with other newcomers is very important if we are to do action items. We don't want to be here just talk and talk and talk. We want action, and we want each person and each organization across the country to work directly with Indigenous communities to make sure that our service users are aware of the history and the current realities of Indigenous communities. The website is right there if you did not get a chance, but just wanted to make sure I bring this back to the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mbalu. Thank you for adding this information about the collective. Now, we open the floor for questions. And if you don't feel comfortable speaking, put your questions in Q&A session, not the chat box, because people are making comments and thanking each other, saying goodbyes. That's why your question might get lost, but I'm going to try my best to monitor the chat box as well. I see that Nasreen asked how we can engage further. I believe this was answered by Mbalu, but if other panelists would like to answer this question, please just unmute yourself.
Yeah, I think, Bettin, you already answered it. Sorry. Next week, join us online. If you can just send maybe, you can send me an email, maybe I'll put in my email, or any one of the panelists here, get in contact with us and we'll send you the link for you to join. And maybe even on our website, Chizuru, if we can just post the link there for folks who would like to attend, I think that would be great.
Thank you, Mbalu. There is a question saying, I'm sorry if I missed this. I think someone mentioned we could join the June 11 meeting. If so, how do we express interest in joining? Can anyone join?
Yes, anyone can join again, and I'll put it on our website.
Sorry, Balu, I
I know
think it's
because-
best. Sorry,
ahead there.
Balu, I think it's best that the folks send the email to you to get on a list.
Okay,
Like having on the website wouldn't be a best idea, because it's
Okay.
accessible to the public. So maybe you
Okay.
can, yeah, thanks.
I'll put my email address.
Thank you, Mbalu.
Thank you, Chizuru.
I don't see any hands. I'm just checking the chat box. Yes, a lot of folks are asking about next week events.
There was a question from Mark Ballard.
Oh, sorry, I missed that. Would you like to read it?
Sure. Mark Ballard says, SAFE CG SAW had a failed attempt to create a First Nations relationship for newcomer refugees and ourselves. What would be a suggested for an approach to start a relationship in rural Nova Scotia?
Sorry,
Okay.
I'm still.
It's a really good question
Yeah.
that Mark has, and it comes up often because there are often, we try to reach out, we try to build these relationships, but we don't get the reception that we might want. And I think it speaks to a lot of the groundwork that I talked about today. That's and that idea of what we want to run into relationship and build these relationships. But we really do need to come at people in a much different way. And we really need to show what we've done to earn their trust. And it's ultimately a really slow process. And don't let that failure stop you. I would suggest, again, going to people, going to communities, partaking in their events and celebrations, really as a quiet observer and in a real culturally humble way where you just attend and absorb, and slowly over time those relationships will come. And that really is, I can't emphasize how slowly it evolves, and it really is just taking that time. And I think it also speaks to the mentality of guest versus settler. So really not, again, Indigenous people aren't obligated to any of this. We have so many problems in our own communities to address. So this is, again, where I encourage you, do work on your own, do work without having to lean immediately on Indigenous folks. And eventually, once you've demonstrated your commitment, those relationships will come, and they're just going to take a lot of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Alex, I would have to agree, and I would just add, if you're in a rural community, you will probably see your the Indigenous community on a regular basis. You'll see them. You'll get to know a little bit about who they are, and that's the best way. It really is show up and have cultural humility, and don't come in with an ask. Come in with that attitude of, I just want to learn. I just want to be here. Is there anything I can do? As we said before, like sometimes responsibility of a Orange Shirt Day event might fall on the Indigenous community. Ask and see if you can do anything to help, to volunteer, to support that. Or maybe if there isn't one in your community, you might want to start an event and welcome them in. Another important piece is not only being connected to the land, but also sharing experiences over a meal. I think everyone knows that it's so important. Sharing a meal in community is a wonderful way to connect.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you, Alex, for your response. Is there any other questions? I am not able to see all the participants. If you are raising your hand and you only see yourself, please unmute yourself and ask your question. If not, I have a question, and maybe to Alex or other panelists. When we speak about indigenous people, the problems they're having, or like colonialism, we speak as if it happened in the past and it's history. And right now we have to reconcile, talk about these things, document these things, not repeat these things. But my understanding is there are a lot of issues are still going on. When we talk about like decolonization, I don't know if we stop the colonization. So colonization should stop first, then we can start decolonizing the land or ourselves or our perspectives. So I was wondering, what are the expectations of indigenous communities from newcomers or settlement sectors in terms of addressing today's issues when forming a solidarity or showing collaboration and expressing this, like just intentions? How do we go beyond that, addressing today's issues, not just the past?
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that, Metin, especially because it is one of the common misperceptions and what we often hear from non-Indigenous people. It's like, why get over it, right? Get over it, because there is this misunderstanding that these are all things that happened in the past. And it is absolutely not true. It is active and ongoing. And in some ways, just the same, just like I described that thread through the residential school system to do the 60 scoop through the child welfare system now, then then those kids get handed over to the criminal justice system. So that institutionalization of Indigenous people is happening right now as we speak. We also have these intergenerational trauma, right? So all of this, I think, as any community who has undergone as a community significant trauma, genocide, we know that gets in our bones and we hand it down to our children, even who didn't experience that trauma firsthand, but it becomes inherited. So we have generations and generations. And this is where that magnitude of the problem comes in, because when you really sit and think about it, it is just an enormous, just an enormous level of violence that I don't think has really been seen anywhere in human history. And it's not just happened to Indigenous people here on Turtle Island, it's global. And this is where you talk about, colonialism is still happening. It's still rolling along. And if it would have its way with us, it would continue to extract every last little bit out of the land we live on. And we're seeing the consequences of that right now. And so I don't think we can wait for it to stop. We need to decolonize ourselves now. And because that's the force that will stop it, is as we step out of it and as we decolonize ourselves and learn to look through an Indigenous lens, learn to know when we are coming and operating from a colonial perspective, being able to identify, take that lens off and put on an Indigenous lens. The trouble is that Indigenous lens won't show you anything unless it's well informed, and it takes a long time to inform it. And so it's a challenge, and it comes back to that learning and making space and time to do that learning, where you will at once understand that nothing has ended, that nothing is over. And that, I think, is the most important act of allyship that you can do, is to learn the truth. And then really it's look to Indigenous communities and ask them how you can best be a support. We know, here in Manitoba, there has been over the last couple years now a strong call from the Indigenous community to search the landfills for the three missing women who are believed to be in the landfills. We think that if these women were not Indigenous, we would have searched for them already. It's such an important point, opportunity for reconciliation would be just to search those damn landfills. And yet, so what you can do, the thing is 1 million Indigenous people can stand up and scream about that and ask for it. And until non-Indigenous people stand up with us, that's when, because the government listens when enough people speak out. And unfortunately, they're very used to not listening to us. And if they would have their way, they wouldn't care about any of this stuff. So one of the most important things you can do is to write your elected officials, speak out, tell them you're unhappy. Make sure they know you care because they're counting on your apathy.
Thank you very much, Alex. Any other panelists wanted to elaborate on it, or I see Berivan's hand? Berivan, please.
Can I speak? Can I just
Sure,
follow up
sure,
on
sure.
Alex's point? I'm sorry. So just quickly for the people in Ontario, I guess, well, across wherever, but Grass Narrow Nations just filed the against the federal and the provincial government. So like you could also really actively support their cause to address the Mercury issues. So I think I'm gonna put on a chat the informations and how you can maybe be in support and solidarity with the communities as well. I'm sorry to say that I actually have to go. So very nice to meet you all, and
Thank you very much. Thank you for the excellent presentation. Thank you
Sorry.
for taking the time to be here today. Thank you, Chizuru. We will stay with other folks who can remain for another maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes, depending on the number of questions we receive. Berivan, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Metin. It's an excellent webinar and excellent presentations, and we just listened to it with goosebumps. And thank you for sharing all these resources. I'm from OCASI and working for IRC NFF, which is Immigrant, Refugees and Communities and Neighbors, Families, Friends campaign for ending gender-based violence. And since Chizuru, she left Mbalu, maybe you can also give me the resources that I can go, because you said that she mentioned that you have also a lot of information about from Indigenous women related to gender-based violence. Maybe if you can share with me the resources or any data with me later on, it will be great. And I can also use for our campaigns. We are providing also gender-based violence trainings for the people who are coming from different communities, and we call them peer champions. One of the issue all the time, it comes back to me, just reducing the indigeneity and the indigenous women issues related to gender-based violence, always social justice issues, reducing the just so-called, it's a social justice issues. Let's do some activism on this. And that's it. And no one doesn't want to, even in our trainings, doesn't want to touch upon the colonialism. It's still going on. And thank you so much, Metin. You mentioned that. And another point, I think you all covered really, really well, the changing or transforming the language we use. Because there are some words also, land back, for example, land back movement. It's so scary for the immigrants or immigrant communities or refugee communities, that it always also comes back to me in my trainings. Okay, what they mean by that, what they mean by that. And these discussions, I know it's very sensitive, but using these resources and the language you're using. And Alex, thank you so much again, because as a Kurdish woman from Turkey, I always feel this burden. This is as if my obligation to teach the colonizers. And this is their responsibility to connect with us. This is their responsibility to create this safe environment for Indigenous people. And this was so excellent. And I just want to thank you again using this language. And I think I will come back to you and your resources, because I'm also working with ESL teachers as peer champions. They definitely need this website, and I already shared on the WhatsApp communication list I have right away. Just I was listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And the agency is actually Achieve, and Achieve has very good materials for teachers, right? So please Google Achieve, or when you go to our website, you'll find all the materials there for teachers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for your question, and Mbalu for the response. Yeah, and I think folks wanted to connect with you later on after this webinar. Like if you want to leave your email addresses on the chat box, because there is a lot to cover. There are a lot of resources, and people have more questions. Berwan, you have your hand on, is it?
And Sobia as well. I think we had Sobia as well.
Sobia?
Yes, Sobia. I saw Sobia.
Please
Yes,
go
can
ahead.
you hear me?
Sure,
Thank
yes, we do.
you. I just wanted to thank everybody here, but I also wanted to recognize when all the speakers spoke, it really gave us some homework and kind of gave us an indication that, you know, the work is not done and complete yet. And with everything that's going around the world, you know, colonialism is a real thing and it's existing and still exists. It's not a thing of the past. So, you know, in the settlement sector, when we're receiving clients from various backgrounds that have gone through various things in their life, I think it's just so important to combine all of that experience, the Indigenous learnings, their experience, and what the government failed at and what's to come. I think this whole learning circle that you've created here and the space that you gave us, I think it was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for these kind words. I know everybody's tired. It's been more than 3 hours. I just want to make sure that we don't exclude anyone in the chat box.
If I may very quickly, and I wanted to Mbalu's point about the Discovery Canada book. One of the things that I loved the most when I was doing frontline was teaching the citizenship preparation class. And I do remember a long time ago thinking it was atrocious. And I would spend a little bit of time. I think that was my, but this is the thing, back in the day, back in that time, you felt like, oh, you were, you know, ruffling feathers, right? But I remember explaining, especially the many parts, the residential system, the 60 scoop, and the voting system. And I would say to the clients over and over, I said, who were the last people allowed to vote here in this country? It was the Indigenous people. I said the first people that could vote was white male land owners. And then it came little by little, but who were the last ones? The first people here, their land, they were. So I remember drawing those conclusions and people being like, oh wow, you know. But from a personal perspective, I just want to say thank you and I think what I really needed to hear was that just do it, do that work. You know the discourse, you know the narrative, you know the history. Do that work with your clients. I think sometimes we feel like, are we saying something inappropriate? We don't want to be disrespectful to our Indigenous brothers and sisters. But I think what I'm taking away from this is no, we know what to do with our clients, and we can just go ahead. And thank you for the resources and for all the information today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carmen. Alex, do you want to remind what you told us about being uncomfortable, discomfort, and what emerges from that? I think after Carmen's comment on being afraid of speaking about these issues, maybe it's better to remember what you said.
Yeah, discomfort is the medicine. It's what will lead us through to a better place, because we can't change the systems, we can't change the structure, we can't shut down colonialism without being disruptive, without speaking up. I know I'm always afraid. I'm more of an introvert. I like to, you know, kind of stay out of the spotlight, but you know, it's just gotten to the point where I needed to be brave to just speak, because it's come to the point where things need to be done, things need to be said. And so that discomfort we feel is really healing. And we just can't be afraid of it, can't be afraid to be disruptive. So we need to be brave in that way, in terms of being brave to speak, being brave to disrupt, and then on the other side of things, being brave to listen and know when we need to change the way we're thinking or our approach, or when we're coming from a colonized perspective and need to change that. So it really is a good thing and a healing thing.
Thank you very much. I guess we have to end it at some point. But before we end, I want to also tell like something about what we do at OCASI. Yes, we all have a lot of work to do. Yes, this is not in our mandate. Maybe like our projects are not funded for this sort of roundtables or events, or we don't have time for these things in our minds. But in terms of encouraging the organization to take a step forward, I would suggest something we do at OCASI. I think everybody has 1 hour to dedicate to this subject, just 1 hour. I am sure there are people in your organizations interested in this subject as you are, as passionate as you are, want to do something as you do. Come together once in a month, 1 hour, share resources, notify each other about the events happening, about Indigenous people, demonstration, protests, all these things will take 1 hour per month, per employee, per organization. But the difference it will make, like we can't even imagine if everybody does that in their organizations, the difference toward truth and reconciliation. What Alex said, it's not up to indigenous people to tell us over and over and over and again what happened to them. Just let at least turn into the action the knowledge we have, which is colonialism ruined this people's life, still ruining it. And we are on this stolen land as a newcomer. So in regard to that, I also want to mention that there is a course on OCASI's website. It's actually not OCASI's website. Let me just check. It's Learn at Work website. Mahta, I would appreciate if you could put the link for this course. The course called Addressing Anti-Indigenous Racism in the Immigrant and Refugee-Serving Sector. I personally learned a lot from this course. It's about like specifically aimed to assisting newcomer and migrant people who work in the immigrant and refugee serving sector to learn about the past and present day experience of anti-Indigenous racism experienced by the original peoples of this land, known as Canada today. As racialized migrant people, participants will be supported to critically reflect on their own experiences, their role as settlers on Indigenous lands, and the commonalities and differences that too of Indigenous peoples. The course is mainly aimed at supporting people who work in the immigrant and refugee serving sector in Ontario, but realistically, it's open to everyone. In terms of course registration, my colleague Maggie told me that they're hoping to have it open for this upcoming fall, most likely by the end of October. But this is not guaranteed. So it's best for you to look out for the course on Learn at Work website. You can also contact Maggie via email. I think her email address will be in the chat box in a second. Yes. And I also want to apologize from our interpreters, ASL interpreters. They told us to identify yourself every time you speak. So we forgot to do that. And if we spoke fast, I apologize people who needed interpretation for this session. And I apologize for the hard time we gave to our ASL interpreters. And also I want to acknowledge the work Mahta and Tarana did in organizing this event. And Alex, I can't thank you enough. You brought all these exceptional panels together. You did a lot of work with me. And Mbalu, CCVT is doing excellent work. I really appreciate. I read your article report, and I am following closely what CCVT is doing in this, and we have a lot to learn from them. If there is no other like last minute comments or thoughts, we are gonna end our session today. But this is just a baby step toward reconciliation. Please be in touch. Please, you have our email addresses. We need to continue to learn from one another and turn this knowledge into action. These are my last words. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Metin.